Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising. As we begin today, I want to just note that today, May 3rd, is World Press Freedom Day, and the UN organization UNESCO awarded the World Press Freedom Award to the journalists in Palestine. Who have been experiencing systematic assassinations by the Israeli government over the last several months. To give a measure of what we're dealing with as we think of Palestinian journalists receiving the highest honor on this day, in the Second World War, which lasted about 6 years, 68 journalists were killed. In the Vietnam War, which lasted about 20 years, there were 69 journalists that were killed. And in the first 5 months of the Jewish-Israeli genocide in Gaza, supported by the United States, over 130 journalists in Palestine and foreigners have been killed. The latest number as of today is 143. That gives you a measure of the campaign, deliberate, orchestrated campaign to eliminate journalists covering the genocide in Gaza. The other side of that, which I think is important for Americans in particular to note, who consider themselves the freest country in the world, that's actually not true. The Journalists Without Borders organization on an annual basis releases a ranking of countries with press freedom. And they released their report yesterday, and the United States ranks country number 55 in terms of press freedom. And we've seen that as the protests across the university campuses on hundreds of university and college campuses, where there have been, as of yesterday, over 2,000 arrests. Harvard, University of Pennsylvania presidents forced to resign because they weren't cracking down enough on the protesters and eliminating free speech. So the press persecution and academic persecution around the Palestinian protests is unprecedented in the history of the United States of America. I came of age during the Vietnam War, and there was never an instance where a college president was forced to resign because they allowed free speech on the campuses. It's very important for all of us on this World Press Freedom Day to understand a few things about press freedom that we are being led to forget. Free speech has no meaning unless you can say what you want. Hate speech is protected by the US Constitution, supported by a number of rulings of the Supreme Court of the United States. As an American citizen, I should be able to say whatever I want about President Biden or Donald Trump. Donald Trump should be able to say whatever he wants about the 2020 election. The only time where free speech is circumscribed legally and constitutionally in the United States is, of course, in the famous case of yelling fire, fire in a crowded theater. If your words cause a violent result that injures people, then free speech is curtailed because you have to balance public safety. But in no instance in the last several months among the Palestinian protesters was there any violence, and yet university after university, compelled by the Israeli lobby and the US government, has been repressing the free speech of both students and faculty. The faculty in most of the universities have been overwhelmingly in support of the Palestinian protests. And I want to just note President Biden's short statement yesterday, where he made it clear that the protests were causing chaos on the campuses, and this would not be allowed because we have to have law and order. And then he made the statement that there was no way that anything that was being done by the protests were going to influence in any way what he was going to do as president of the United States. Simultaneously, what wasn't carried in the mainstream news was that the Democratic Students, University Students Association that represents all the Democratic students clubs across the United States and institutions of higher education issued a statement saying that they were appalled at the way the government and the Israeli lobby were pressuring universities to repress free speech, and stated very clearly that this was going to impact their ability to organize during the upcoming November elections. President Biden's polling numbers are at the lowest level of his presidency. National polls are showing that former President Donald Trump, even in the midst of a hush money trial in New York, the trial has not impacted his polling numbers. And in fact, he's widening his lead over Joe Biden in many of the polls. So we have a situation where the comportment of the US government may contribute to the demise of a US president in the next election. Not so much that Trump is winning, but that Biden is losing because of what he's doing to support Israel's genocide in Palestine. And I would add that it is extraordinarily synchronistic that not only did the police on April 30th, a few days ago, when they came in and eliminated all the protesters at Columbia University, it was at the same day and virtually the same hour of the night that the police did the same thing 56 years ago to eliminate the Columbia protesters that had taken over the administration building and so forth in 1968. I say this because guess where the Democratic Convention is going to be this year? In Chicago. And if you remember your history, the protests at the Democratic Convention in Chicago contributed mightily to the demise of the Democratic candidate, Hubert Humphrey, in the election that the Republican Richard Nixon won in 1968. And already the discussion in the college campuses and among the Palestinians are that they all need to show up in Chicago. So the way history is now playing itself out, and the way the choices that are made and the statements that are made are reverberating to the past and with possible effects on the future, is an extraordinary thing to behold, because it speaks to a unity of history and a contextualization of choice within the context of a momentum, a rhyming of history that is profoundly poignant at this time. So it's within this context that we want to turn to a book that I just read. I just finished it up last night, The Story in Our Bones, which is one of the more intriguing titles that I've come across lately. And so I want to welcome back Osprey Orielle Lake. She's been on Humanity Rising several times before. You all know her. She's the founder of the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network. She's been working tirelessly on the front lines, activating, organizing, and promoting women activists, particularly Indigenous women that are working on the front lines of climate justice, the rights of nature, earth justice, and has been singularly successful in her efforts over the past years. She's an artist. I first knew her when she was an artist. And it's been a real privilege, Osprey, to know you and track your work over these decades now, and now to invite you to talk about your new book, The Story is in Our Bones. So why don't we just start, because that's why I was emphasizing the synchronicities between Columbia now and Columbia back in '68 and the Democratic Convention coming up in Chicago. History, our stories are in our bones. And we have these cyclic patterns that we live out. So tell us in the first instance about the title of your book. I'm just very intrigued at where that came from and how you chose it.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be on this show with you and to have this time to have a conversation. And welcome to all those who are listening in, and for your comments. I'll give the full title of the book, which is The Stories in Our Bones, and then the subtitle is How Worldviews and Climate Justice Can Remake a World in Crisis. And so the book is really about our worldviews and also climate justice and the broader sense of justice overall. And how, when we look at our worldviews, we can remake our world. But without that component of understanding our worldviews, as you were just saying, history will repeat itself, meaning that we can move into patterns of recreating the systems of oppression and the systems that are detrimental to us over and over again if we don't go to the root causes and we don't actually understand where these paradigms come from, both historically, but as individuals. I mean, sometimes when we look at history, we sort of see it as this film that has played out that we're observing, but we always have to remember that we humans are generating that story. We are the generators of that story, our consciousness, our thoughts, our beliefs, our worldviews, how we think the world came into being, all the different codes of conduct that humans have structured are what plays out in the real world. And so the book is really going upstream and looking at very real issues, because as you know, on a daily basis, I'm, in there stopping deforestation, stopping pipelines, generating projects to reforest and, have food sovereignty and move to clean energy. So there's real fires that have to be put out the crisis in Gaza, all of it we have to deal with immediately with people's lives on the line and ecosystems on the line. It's absolutely critical. But at the same time, we will repeat unless we go back to root causes and understand, how do we unpack and unravel these systems to transform them? Sort of like when you go to the doctor, if you're ill, they're going to diagnose you before they treat you. And we're in that moment where we need to turn our eyes inward as well as outward and take action. But where do we come from and how do we have solutions that are going to work if we don't actually get to the root causes and understand the systemic issues at hand? And I'll just name a few, and then I'm going to get to the bones in a second. But, it's really important to understand why the bones. So, so it's very specific. We're talking about the systems of colonization, racism, patriarchy, and capitalism. And I would add also in this moment that has led to imperialism and militarism at such a accentuated way at this point. And so we need to dismantle those systems and transform them. They're the systems we're swimming in, but they're creating enormous violence, to say the least, to ourselves, our bodies, to women, to Indigenous and Black and Brown communities, particularly anything that doesn't fit into the white supremacy model or the wealthy elite. And so when I was writing this book, I'm really looking at the story in our bones part comes from the fact that we are the actors in this earth lineage. We are the active participants. And one of the things that is really out of balance is how much humans in the dominant culture, and I say the dominant culture, and I define this in the book because it's not true for all people. It's not true for land-based or Indigenous peoples who've kept an intact relationship with the land. But mostly for the dominant culture, there's a deep feeling of orphanage from the earth in the way that we have evolved our cultural story and narrative, whether we look at culture, society, religions. There's been this huge disconnect. And that orphanage from the earth, that earth lineage, has been incredibly detrimental in the human adventure of our experience here on this planet. And when you even say it, it sounds insane. Like, how can we be separate from nature and the earth that sustains us? But this is a mind construct that we're in right now. And so when I talk about the stories in our bones, it's a way to indicate, to remember who our bodies are connected to the land, in the earth, in our stories, and also how in our bones, literally in terms of science, it's the place where every day, millions and millions and millions of red blood cells are created every day inside our bones. And every day it's carrying our DNA. And so how do we actually get into understanding that we are already carrying within us our memory of when we lived close with the land and in harmony with the earth, in balance with the natural cycles and one another. And it doesn't mean somewhere in the distant past, everything was perfect and we all lived together well and everything was, without strife or struggle. No, but there was a lot of sense making about our place within the context of the web of life, within the laws of nature, which also includes other humans and all other species. And we've really strayed from that. So how do we get back inside our story, reclaim our story, regenerate our story? And I also love the whole idea of the bones because as we look at how they're a place of regeneration every day with all these blood cells being created, it's a place also of world making. This is where internally we are creating ourselves. So how are we creating ourselves within this story and in this time where we really need to focus on remaking our world? Well, it's going to start within us.
Beautiful, beautiful. I was listening to a documentary on water, and it was talking about how water, 99% of our bodies are made up of actually of water molecules. And the way the water works in the bones is very, very specific. And so that the story being in our bones, the memory being in our bones, the connectivity in our bones is a very powerful metaphor. I just love the title. Very well chosen. Now, one of the themes that I was very impressed by all the way through the book is the way you weave the past with the future, that we can't really move with the kind of expansiveness and possibility into the future unless we're deeply, deeply grounded in our past. So talk a little bit about that notion that you use in the book, because many books are very contemporary, and there's no sense of time. But you have a beautifully poetic use of time in the book. And reminded me of T.S. Eliot's notion that time past and time future are all contained in time past, and time past contained in time future. And the end is before the beginning, and the beginning is after the end. And I've just felt that all the way through your book. So speak to us about that. That was such a poignant part.
Well, I'll tug at a few of the pieces because it is such a deep part of the book. So I'll just try to pull out a few nuggets right now. Yeah, time is very important because I think we're in a moment, again, speaking of the dominant culture, which is quite destructive, in which we have, and certainly Thomas Berry has talked about this, the great theologian Thomas Berry, around the story that we're in right now. And I think that we have lost the theme of our story in many ways right at the moment, or rather there's a lot of disruption and violence and corruption of the story that we're in. And it's not a healthy story. And so I think one of the things that's very valuable in this moment, so we can get oriented and get balanced and get recentered in our earth lineage and who we are as a species that can be very life enhancing versus destructive and violent and extractive, is to really remember our ancestries and remember where we are in this very large arc of the human journey, which in terms of our planet Earth is extremely short. Even though we think, we're this very important species that has been here and is conducting and are the great players of the universe. The fact is we have not been here that long compared to how long other species have been on this planet and the evolution of this magnificent Earth that we're so honored to be a part of. And so I'm looking at time in a sense that how important it is to remember our own lineages of when we were connected to the earth and really learn about our ancestries, not sort of as a distant past, but as a way to learn about our present formation today and our present structures. So as an example, I give a lot of stories from the past that are both beautiful about practices of reciprocity and understanding what it means to be in a reciprocal relationship with the land that we all come from, but also looking at a lot of the warning stories that came from a lot of European ancestries, where our own ancestors were telling us that we were starting to lose our relationship with that sacred, holy commitment and code of conduct with the earth, and those laws of nature that we need to protect, and also to keep in balance with really upholding those codes of conduct to live in a good way in the web of life. And so I tell the story of Gilgamesh as an example, particularly focusing on the part where Gilgamesh goes out with Enkidu to go, cut down the ancient cedar forest, and how it brings so much destruction. But all the goddesses and gods are warning them, don't do it, but they do it anyway. And so this, going back to sort of this history of this extractive idea of taking from the land out of balance of the laws and nature saying no, but that hubris of humans to go forward. And we also see the rise in that story of the patriarchy. It had already been in existence, but it takes on a new sort of strength at that point. And we're talking about, thousands of years ago, a story about don't destroy the forests. And yet we have not listened to that warning story, but it's in our own recording. And it has been something that has been, written and studied, but we haven't learned that lesson yet. And so we're at this moment of reckoning right now, in this very moment, with the whole world in what many scholars are calling a polycrisis. And so we need to understand where we're coming from, not only to learn about the beauty of our nature, but also, where we took turns that have become really detrimental. Because it's, again, really hard to heal something if you can't name it and know what it is. I think there's also in the past, when we look really far past, I also talk about this in the beginning of the book about really understanding our universe story, because in essence, all of us are made up of, the components of what the stars brought to the earth in the beginning of our solar system. And, that might sound very esoteric, but the fact is, when we really embody the fact of evolution and where our bodies come from, we really do see that there is no separation between us and other humans, and this othering that has happened. And people who have white skin are more important than other people, or men are more important than women. And we have, supremacy over nature. All begins to crumble if we change our worldview to recognize the long earth lineage that we're a part of and part and particle of nature. That worldview really shifts how we exist in this moment. When we look at the root causes of colonization, when we look at the beginning of the rise of racism and patriarchy, and all these things that create separation and violence and an idea of supremacy overall, these are the kinds of worldviews that need to be dismantled and destructed and transformed and composted into something else. And without that knowledge of the past, it's very hard to accurately and deeply address this moment. So we are seeing, as you were talking about, what is happening in Gaza, what is happening to the fact that the climate crisis is increasing. And we can see that we're burning the planet, it's flooding, it's on fire. And yet, why are we continuing? Well, we have these systems that have not been disentangled. And so we can't just build on top of that. Or here in the United States, people are having to have reparations and, really a different kind of reckoning and reparations with Indigenous and Black and Brown communities after hundreds of years of colonization. So it turns out, if you don't have healthy soil, you don't have healthy ground, which means a healthy past that has been resolved, you will continue as a society to be violent, to extract, to have supremacy, where some people are winning and other people are losing, and we're not really in harmony with each other in the land. And so this is why it's so important to really understand that we need a historical assessment at this point to collect ourselves, because it's not only negative, though there's a lot of negative things to look at and hard things to look at that are essential that we work our way through and dismantle and wrestle with and bring healing to and have reparations for. We will also discover beautiful things about our ancestry that give us the strength to then go forward, because right now there's not a lot of strength that a lot of people have to look at the hard things, because they also don't know the beauty of their ancestors, because it's all been erased and thrown out by modernity and also these really extreme patriarchal religious institutions. And I'm not against religion, and I'm not a religious scholar. I'm just saying that the way that organized religion has perpetuated itself is based on patriarchy and is based on extractivism and supremacy. And so we see the result of that around the world, and it makes it very difficult for people to draw upon their healthy nature, their healthy ancestries, to stand strong in this moment, to work our way through incredibly difficult circumstances.
Thank you. Now let's drill down a bit on the worldviews, because that's really a foundational point that you make in the subtitle, and then also as you start your book, and you have patriarchy, we have racism, we have colonialism, we have capitalism, we have imperialism, we have militarism. As you see this cluster, do you see them as different worldviews, or basically a single worldview with different manifestations? Talk to us about worldviews in relationship to these cluster of tyrannies, I would say, that are really scourging our earth right now at every level.
Well, worldviews is such a vast topic, you know, and it's also a very exciting topic. And I think that, you know, when we talk about worldviews, we're talking about, you know, how we understand the world came into being. What are our beliefs? They impact everything from our culture to our politics. They're the ground that we stand on. So where did they come from? And at this critical moment of so many crises, I think it bears to witness to say that we absolutely need to look at them, because we can't, as I was saying before, build upon unhealthy ground. So for me, talking about worldviews is going right down to the ground. Where do we stand? What do I believe? What do I understand is sense making around the world around me? What are our codes of conduct? Are we actually operating from a map that is healthy and just? And so when we're looking at, you know, the different systems of oppression that we've named, I think that they are all interconnected. When you tug on one, it connects you to the other. Excuse me, I don't think that you can really separate them out, because this idea of dominion over, whether it's dominion over the land or dominion over other people and having supremacy and creating this hierarchy, turns out to be a really bad idea and extremely dangerous for everyone and the living systems of the earth. And so, you know, I see that as soon as we have sort of the separation narrative and othering, then you have some groups that are going to be oppressing others. So if you have the patriarchy, you see the rise of, you know, a one male God structure, monotheism, which immediately begins to separate out humanity from the web of life in a sacred and holy way. It immediately not only changes the balance of the goddesses and gods, but throws down the feminine, women's leadership, which has turned out to be very dangerous. And the role of women right now is so critical, which is why we have the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, and how to really express the need for egalitarian societies and why we need all of us engaged. This idea that, you know, certain people are more important than others, whether it's the patriarchy or colonization, where we see, you know, for thousands of years, people going into other communities and exercising power over them and extracting from their lands and enslaving those people. I mean, this has been going on for a long time, which also gives rise to capitalism, because it generates the groundwork for an extractive economy, where we're just taking and staking, because now we have dominion over the land, dominion from others. And so this huge generation of extractive ideas has been born in the human construct, in our human social patterns. And again, racism, you can see, you know, it leads to, again, there being people who have supremacy over others. And so I think they're all really intertwined. And the reason it's so important to unpack them is that, you know, when we look at, you know, the climate crisis or environmental degradation as an example, in a world where there is not colonization or racism, we would not be pushing past the planetary boundaries, and there would not be so much social injustice. Because if you don't have a place to extract fossil fuels or coal, then you actually can't continue that form of energy, because it's harming people. Any frontline community person will tell you that they're being poisoned by fossil fuels, their waters are being poisoned by extractive industries from mining and all kinds of things. But this is not happening primarily white, wealthy communities. It's not. And we see also the conflict between the global north and the global south, and how much extractions happened from the wealthy countries in the global south, and land grabs, and I could go on, and the devastation to indigenous peoples through colonization, people who actually have the knowledge how to live in harmony with the land, who we need to be learning from and sitting at the feet of and learning from at this point through colonization and extraction. There has been genocides of indigenous people over the world for hundreds and hundreds of years. But if we can move these systems and dismantle them and transform them, there would be a communal decision globally around, what we actually need to live as humans, and how are we doing that without other communities suffering because of those activities. So that's just like one example of, how holistically we need to be restructuring ourselves from these systems of oppression, but we have to name them and understand them and be in the discomfort of looking internally, looking societally, and having the courage, if we're going to survive and live in a healthy way with each other in the earth, we must come into these conversations. And also, not only are they uncomfortable, but also to add, there's enormous joy and freedom in those conversations, because as you start talking to people, there's no one I've had these conversations with who at some point don't say like, I don't feel like I belong. Something's not right. I'm disconnected. The world seems to be, completely out of my control. How do I fit into this moment? And so it might be uncomfortable, but in the end, there's a deep sense of freedom and justice and healthiness that comes out of these deep inquiries that I think is really key.
Mm. It was reminding me of the Social Contract by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, written before the French Revolution in the middle of the 18th century, where he was grappling with many of these issues. And then he set himself this question, well, then what was the original sin? How did we start to go off? And his answer, which I'd like to have you comment on, he says that when the first man looked upon a field and said, "This is mine," he says that's the original sin.
Mm.
What would be your comment on that? Would you agree with Rousseau? Would you say there's another kind of an original trespass that you would identify that gave rise to this interconnected, really a miasm of the human spirit based on coercion and subordination and exploitation and so forth?
Yeah, Rousseau's comment really points to this hyper individualism that we're experiencing. And also, like, this is mine versus collectively, I belong to the land with my community. This is mine. And also, again, this idea of supremacy and separation from nature, because it talks, it's like speaking about this idea that we own the property of this place versus that we are guests here on this beautiful earth that we belong to versus that we own. And so I think it speaks to that. And I would go upstream a little bit more and talk about something that I have been researching and have learned from a lot of my Indigenous mentors and colleagues, which I really wanted just to take a moment to say, that 80% of all the biodiversity left on Earth, our forests, our waters, are in the hands and lands of Indigenous peoples. And, 80%. And there's a reason for that, which is their worldview about the relationship to the land, and the land being our relative, not something that we're above or own or is here for only our human use and extraction, but that the rivers and waters and the forests are alive, and we're all part of this living web of life in an animate cosmology, which I think is also really important here to sort of speak to where we took a turn that was not so healthy, is losing that sense that that we're part of this living universe, an animate cosmology where the stones are alive, the birds are alive, and we are in conversation with them, and we are relatives within that framework, which would really change also our destructive behavior, coming back into the circle of belonging with the land. But to get to your question, I wanted to also bring something else up that I learned from Indigenous people. There's a really powerful book called Columbus and Other Cannibals by Jack Forbes, a very striking title itself. And within it, he talks about something that is, throughout Indigenous communities. And I believe when we go back to our ancestors, which I like to call pre-colonial, pre-patriarchal ancestors, so we can talk about when we were close to the land. And I think we all had versions of this, but the one I learned because of, current day Indigenous people, something called the Wetiko disease. And there's different terminologies for it. But it's this idea that was taught within communities to, again, these teaching stories that keep us in balance with the earth. And the Wetiko is this idea of someone who was once human, but steps out of the balance of their community and the natural laws of the earth through overconsumption and greed. And there was huge teachings around this because there was an understanding that, if you live in a community and you start over consuming and taking more than is your own, that is more that's healthy from the community just for yourself, and you hoard and you are only focused on yourself and your own needs and greed, and also then that impact on the natural order of the ecosystem you live within, that it is so destructive and violent that you become not human anymore. You're no longer in the circle of humans. And these individuals risk the entire web of life. And so they are, pushed out of the community. There was different ways of discussing what happened, but it was like one of the worst things you could do, in terms of original sin. I don't think it was put in those terminologies, but like this was something that was a great infringement. And there are a lot of teachings around the time of the winter that, everyone needs to share the food in the winter. And if someone's taking too much, it will harm the whole community, as an example. So that infringement was like one of the biggest things you could do, is not care for a community or the ecosystem you are in. And so I think this Wetiko disease is something, that I surface in the book as well, to kind of get at, how to not go down that dangerous road, and how to have these teaching stories that continue to keep us in alignment. And the last piece I'll say about that, because it's really heavy and it's a lot to talk about just in a few minutes on this conversation, but I go into it in detail so we really understand what this is about and what happened with European settlers and this colonized thinking, which is based on this Wetiko paradigm of taking for me, and separating ourselves out from the natural laws. But what is beautiful, and another teaching from a very powerful scholar from who's Aboriginal from Australia, again, someone who carries, they don't call it Wetiko disease there, but other terminologies. What I loved about it is that unlike a lot of teachings that we get in our dominant society, excuse me, there is a way to have reparations and healing. So they have these rock formations in Australia where people who have been in that cycle of having disrupted the community natural order or crossed that line with the natural world, they have stones that represent that teaching. And so as they walk through the land, they point to that stone and they talk about that teaching, because it's not filled with judgment. It is a teaching that humans are going through in their adolescence or in their learning and evolution as a species. And once the person does that, they can have reparations, they can learn, and they're brought back into the community fully once they make amends and they do whatever practices are required to heal that tear, that break that they had, and they're fully welcomed back into the community. The stone is a part of their teaching, and it is passed on to the next generations. And I really love that, because one of the difficulties we're having in people introspecting and reflecting and doing the internal work we need to do is this idea that we're found out to be evil, and then that's it, you've sinned, and you're sort of thrown out, you will be permanently cast out. And so it's very difficult for people to introspect if they think ultimately when they're going inside, they're going to find out they're a bad person. And it's just sort of, that's it. And you don't get to have reparations, and you don't get to heal. And I don't mean this in a way of spiritual bypassing. You have to actually do the work,
Right.
truly express the sorrow, the apology, and all the reckoning that is truly required, and change in behavior. But we have to find a way to go through this process in the dominant culture, or we will continue this violent expression, and also this huge sense of unsettled ground. Like, what is our identity? It needs to be a healthy identity, a healthy ancestry. We have to go back and retrace and remake these patterns. Otherwise, we will continue to feel like we don't belong, and that creates enormous violence, because you're scrambling to hold on to something because you don't feel you have anything. And of course, this is what we're seeing all over the world right now, and also through overconsumption and trying to buy more and have more things to make up for the fact of this emptiness inside. So it's all very connected, and this is why it's so key that we really retrace and heal these disruptions.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This has been very, very rich. The distinction that you're drawing, I think, is worth just underscoring. Then I want to go on to some other issues in the book. And that is that what I like about Wetiko is that it starts from a fundamental ontology of wholeness from which someone can be separated, and then distortions emerge. But the invitation is always to go back to the wholeness, as opposed to kind of Catholic theology, most of Christian theology, where the original state is not wholeness. The original state is sin. The original state is imperfection, which is why you've got to be saved, so you go to heaven when you die. So that if your worldview is one of wholeness, or your worldview is one of imperfection, that basic ontology determines almost everything that follows. And so I just wanted to make that distinction, because you make it in the book so beautifully, but I just wanted to tease it out that to my mind, that's almost the foundational conception of our worlds. And this is a point that Jung makes, that in the East, there's the Tao. There's always this notion of wholeness. And Western civilization never developed wholeness. So we have the yin and the yang, but we don't have a notion of Tao. We don't have a notion of the totality within which the polarities operate. And that basic gestalt, he says, determines virtually everything that follows. So it's not accidental, therefore, that the colonialism and imperialism, racism, etc., that you're struggling with in the work almost all emanates out of Western civilization. Because if you don't have that basic notion, which the indigenous people have, and like you point out in one of your chapters about the Aboriginals, as the longest continuous kind of society and civilization known, and how they never broke out of the wholeness, and what supported them generation after generation was the song line. That was such a beautifully expressed notion of kind of song line that leads us into the future out of our past, but within a container of wholeness.
Beautiful. Absolutely, yes. Yeah.
So, but anyway, let's jump into the present moment. I want to get to WeCan, and I want to get to the climate crisis and so forth. So, as you look around the world today, Osprey, as someone who travels and interacts at many levels in many cultures. Would you identify the climate crisis as the most pressing crisis, or in light of world events, where do you think the major challenges are today?
It's a good question, because I think we try to identify things in a sequence, in a linear fashion. And as I go deeper and deeper into this work, speaking of time and non-linearity of time, even though we think time is linear, it's not, as scientists and physicists tell us. I don't think you can place one crisis above the other in some ways, because of course the climate crisis is barreling down on us and is existential. So yes, it is absolutely at the top of a list if we were going to make a list. But you really can't get at resolving the climate crisis unless we deal with a lot of these social and economic issues, inequalities and injustices, because environmentalists have tried to do that, to just put the environment first. And while it makes sense, because if you look at the long arc of what's going on, we won't have anywhere, any ground to stand on. There will be no water to drink or food that we can grow on an overheated planet. And so there is a reality to the fact, if we don't deal with the web of life and the Mother Earth who nourishes us and sustains us, we won't be here to have this discussion. We will not exist as a species. So yes, it really puts the climate crisis front and center. But actually, to get at how we address all of these issues, the story changes. Because, as I mentioned earlier, we wouldn't have this extractive economy without these systems of oppression that have to be addressed. The whole world is focused on Palestine and Gaza for the absolute reasons that we should be. We're watching, events unfold that we just couldn't imagine happening right now. And it's immediate, and it has to be like today matters if you're in Gaza and working, trying to survive. Decisions are being made today if people are going to live or die. And this goes on too with, projects that we're working on to protect forests, where you have land defenders, and they could die today for going out and protecting that forest that we all need to live. So we have to deal with emergency situations and address that. And so I think that we have to be very holistic when we look at these issues, and address them from a multifaceted perspective. And this is what we're trying to do at the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network. Is absolutely, we have very on the ground programs. This particular forest, we're working with these particular people, this particular fight. We're trying to stop Line 5 in the United States of America right now. We are working to protect the Otombe rainforest. We have land defenders we're working with in the Global South. I mean, all of these are very real campaigns or projects or, trees that we're planting. At the same time, I think the task is for not everyone wants to be engaged in this, but for those who can, to have the daily activities we're doing hold this upstream understanding of worldview, and how do we infuse the things that we're doing with a different ideology, a different perspective. And I think that's what we can do, because we can't turn away from these crises in front of us. We're all responsible for them. We're responsible for acting. We do direct action. We've been arrested, like we're in it. But also, where are we coming from when we do it? What is the new story we're bringing with us? What's the new paradigm? So we have a transformative change while we're doing it. Because if I could wave a magical wand and end the climate crisis tomorrow, or if I could wave a magical wand and end the crisis in the Middle East, it actually doesn't stop the fact that colonization is still here. We have an extractive economy that's going beyond our planetary boundaries right now. We are destroying communities and the earth. So yes, I want the magical wand and end the climate crisis, and let's resolve the situation in the Middle East. That would be great. I'll take it. But ultimately, we have to deal with these root causes, and we need to go on a journey that is both deeply internal, facing our own internal issues around racism and colonization. The whole issue of what has happened in Gaza has exploded in the world because it tugs on so many issues that have not been dealt with about identity, land, indigeneity, who lives where, people's fear of survival, who's been oppressed, how we deal with trauma or don't deal with trauma, and how it then it expresses itself later.
Exactly.
It's huge. It's so huge. And at the same time, people are dying today. And so we have to do both. We have to do both. And yes, I demand that of myself. I demand that of people around us. We can't have a soundbite world. We need to get nuanced. We need to get educated. And it is upon us to do that. And so, yeah, I think that, it's really critical that the climate crisis is absolutely urgent, but it must be contextualized.
Yeah. And I think just to get one more comment from you, because I think, if I think back, say, 10 or 15 years ago, the climate crisis was just massive in the environmental movement sort of in the world, and you had the IPCC, and you had all these things happening. And I think there was a notion that progress could be made. And I think that not only has kind of wound down as the governments have done less and less and less as the situation has gotten more and more urgent, but the world itself has engaged in upheaval now to where the climate has almost been pushed off the agenda, no less real, as matters of the human psyche, matters of the human soul, which is what Gaza is all about, have taken front and center. So I think what we're coming to is not a situation in which there's a technical fix, as much as a realization that nothing less than a fundamental change of consciousness now is going to suffice to lead us out of a thicket in which everything is interconnected. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we're saying the same thing. The only thing I would add, but I completely agree with you said, is that knowing that, which is the idea of changing our worldviews. But the second part of the title's climate justice is that it is not an excuse to not engage in political discourse, taking action. And that is the caveat, because I don't think it is, I don't think it's a healthy message that people think, oh, it's a consciousness thing, so I'll work on myself. And then everyone's in their room alone meditating, which I meditate. I'm not against that. I think it's a balance between our own internal work and shifting.
Your best friends meditate.
Yes. And do lots of other beautiful practices on the land. I think that we also are responsible for engaging actively, because we, talk about time, what we do now is going to be what the future holds. And if you don't mind, I wouldn't mind just showing that first video, because I wanted to I think it's a great way to show what we're talking about in action. I wanted to show some of the women that we work with and our work at the climate negotiations, because I just sort of wanted to have a feeling of what does it look like to take some of these values, and what does it look like when we're actually in the midst of the struggle. I don't know if you're able to do that. We could give it a try.
Well, here we go.
If not, then we'll just pass on that.
Oh, it's not going into full screen. It's like it froze. And my screen froze for some reason.
Oh.
I'll circle back to that, but
yeah, we can pass if it's not working. That's okay. No
Well,
worries.
but let's, I think what you were just saying, Osprey, is so important, and it leads me to what I think is a real genius of your book. Because as you're saying, many of us think that because it's a question of consciousness, we go into our room and we start to meditate, right? So we start to work on our consciousness. What you bring out in the book is that it's far more holistic than that, and that actually the beginnings of that process are initiated out of reconnecting with our past. And there is when you have a beautiful thread in the tapestry of your book around reconnecting with indigeneity and the indigenous wisdom and women. And that in somehow that catalytic agency or ingredient in the collective psyche, if activated and promoted to its proper role, would be a pathway to the redemption that we seek. So speak to us about this is where the Aboriginals and the notion of the song line, I think, is so profound. But talk to us about the importance of indigenous wisdom, indigenous mind, and the liberation of women in the kind of new worldview and higher consciousness that we all seek.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, just since we were talking about the internal work, I just wanted to also express that, whatever practices people have, it's so valuable, whether it's meditating or walking on the land or gardening or being, in whatever rituals people have to be close to the land. It's really important that we have these practices. It's absolutely essential because we don't really share those on a grand scale communally. And so I just really want to encourage people to not think what we were saying earlier is in any way degrading, that it's critical. That's how we get grounded in who we are and learn who we are and connect with the knowledge of the earth. So it's essential and on par with any external activity. But where are we coming from when we do the external activity then becomes really the question. And that's why that internal work is so key. And so, one of the things that I think, just speaking very practically about women, just so that, we understand it both spiritually, politically, and in the sense of the larger arc of history that we've been talking about today. I think it's important to note that, as an example, there's something called the Women's Political Empowerment Index, which really shows in each country, what women are doing politically, what kind of agency they have, what kind of mobility they have. And there's a really powerful study that shows that just with the 1 unit increase in the Women's Political Empowerment Index in any country in the Global South and North, it leads to a 11.51% decrease in carbon emissions, which is, there's hard to get something over 10% that would actually decrease carbon emissions just by women being in positions of empowerment in their countries. And not that everything's about carbon emissions. A lot is about carbon emissions, but it is not all about carbon emissions. But nevertheless, this is a huge indicator. We saw at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic that countries that were led by women, it was in the news, did far better with their populations than countries led by men. And it's not about putting men down, it's about lifting women up. It's about creating, equality and equity. And so, everything from the spiritual, our well-being as humans, balancing the feminine, care for our Mother Earth, to actual political outcomes and decision-making, we really need to lift up the role of women. And we see this in our movements all over the world, how women are often the backbone of these social and environmental justice movements, even if we're not seeing their names. They are there, and it is absolutely critical. And I feel honored to be working with truly amazing women and gender diverse leaders all over the earth, and also sort of getting away from some of these binaries, to include everyone. And in terms of Indigenous peoples, I think, I've been really, really honored and humbled to have a lot of Indigenous mentors and colleagues from early on in my life. And, I think it's very important that we learn from Indigenous peoples, and show how Indigenous peoples are actually a climate solution, a solution to a lot of crises. It does have to do with the worldview that they are carrying about the respect for our Mother Earth and that intact relationship that has not been lost over time about, how we sit within the universe and that worldview of that we're here to be a life-enhancing species. How we can be here in a way that is in harmony with the land. And so I think it's really critical that we honor and learn from Indigenous peoples. And of course, that's a delicate situation as well, because it would be typical of the dominant culture in its voracious and rapacious modality to go then extract from Indigenous peoples, which happens all the time, which is not what we need to be doing. We need to be sitting at the feet of Indigenous people and listening, not taking, but listening and learning. And I think that's really important. Learning where Indigenous people, where most of us live on stolen lands. Who are the Indigenous people of the lands where we live? Most people have no idea the name of the Indigenous people whose lands they're on. And I really encourage people to do that. And also many Indigenous peoples are still here running active campaigns for land back, Indigenous rights, working to care for the land. Out here in California, we've had these huge, tremendous forest fires because of climate change. And there were practices by Indigenous peoples of their traditional ecological knowledge of having these controlled fire burns that kept all the tinder down. So when the fires came through, they didn't become huge explosions of firestorms. And so slowly, some of those practices are being back by the Forest Service. And that knowledge system by the Karo tribes and other tribes out here are being utilized again, and that knowledge being respected. The way Indigenous people care for the beavers and how beavers are being brought back now because we've destroyed our waterways with the dams. And the way that the beavers run the dams is completely different and build their dams. And so I could go on and on about Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge, but we're talking about people who've lived in a place a very long time and have learned to listen to the land and how to live here in a good way with the land. And so I think for all these reasons, the voices that have been oppressed, Indigenous peoples, women, Black and brown communities, when we free up those voices and center that leadership, that is a really good beginning to chart our way forward. Because the people who are always harmed the most and are on the front lines always know more than the people who are the oppressors or the privileged. And that conversation needs to continue, and that practice and that implementation is something we all need to respect and really put energy and funding and finance and love behind to really push that leadership forward right now.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, let's turn then to a final domain, and that's the Women's Earth Climate Action Network. Of all the people I know, you have activated women and Indigenous in a very, very powerful way over time. And so tell us more about Weekend. Tell us what are your main projects that you're working on, and what the challenges are, and what your successes are, because you've had a lot of very important successes.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, gosh, there's so much. Maybe I'll just pull a few stories, because people can go to our website and see our programs, and I don't want to sort of just give a list. I think it's more interesting to hear stories, but we do, everything from reforestation to protecting old growth forests to, stopping fossil fuel pipelines. We work at the UN climate talks. Every year we bring a frontline women's delegation to, confront governments and to present a different vision of how we should go forward. We do food sovereignty work. So there's quite a wide range of work. We do a lot of policy research and creating policy briefs for people to learn, again, about a different way of looking at the economy, a different way of how we can move ourselves off a fossil fuel economy. And I just would mention two campaigns because I think they're very practical and real, but carry some of the DNA of what we've talked about today. And that's the rights of nature movement. We've been very involved in rights of nature and how important that is to understanding that we need to ensure that we respect the natural laws of the earth, and how rights of nature is a legal construct that really is embedded in indigenous worldviews and an idea that the earth is alive and how we need to respect the rivers and the mountains and the forests. So I would just highlight that campaign and that initiative because it's so powerful. And also something called the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is a parallel mechanism to the Paris Climate Agreement, which mostly deals with carbon emission reductions. And it's an important document because it does present the 1.5 degree guardrail, which we've used and needed to leverage governments to do the right thing, as well as financial institutions. But it doesn't really get at the source, which is we need to actually look at stopping fossil fuels and the supply end, which the Paris Agreement really doesn't deal with. And so there's something called the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is really excited. We're on the steering committee of the treaty, and it's been amazing because I think there's up to 12 countries now that have signed this treaty, including recently at the last COP, Colombia, who signed on, and they're a fossil fuel producing country. So that's pretty impressive. And it provides countries with a mechanism to equitably get off of fossil fuels. And I think we really need, speaking of the fires that have to go out, we have to deal with ending fossil fuels. And it's a mechanism to do that. So I'm pretty excited about those two things. I'll tell one story that, because I'm really excited about what just happened with this, which is we have a reforestation program in the Otombe region, the Democratic Republic of Congo. We've been doing reforestation there for about 8 years. And 25% of the trees that we are growing are for the local communities to use. And 75% of the trees are reforesting decimated lands through slash and burn. And again, this is through colonization, and why these harms to the land came. I won't go into the whole history of that, but we're reforesting this area. And 8 years later, faster than the scientists or foresters thought, is that the trees that we're growing, there's so many of them now, it's actually bringing back the rain. And there's a whole scientific way in which after a certain tipping point happens when you reforest, where the trees then create enough moisture in the atmosphere and call in the rain. And now, in addition to all of the nurseries that we have to grow the trees, nature herself is regenerating herself in what we're calling wild nurseries. And it's amazing to watch this happen rather quickly. And then because we've grown enough trees, we're not completely there, but we're close to having, this huge population area stop using the old growth forest as they utilize the trees we're growing. So we're protecting over 1.6 million acres of old growth forests in the Otombe region, which is part of the Congo Basin. And just from perspective, the Congo Basin is second to the Amazon rainforest in terms of import of world forests. There's the Indonesian forests, the boreal forests, but we need these primary forests for life. Like people have got to get it through heart and mind and soul. Like if we destroy these ecosystems, we're not here. And so it's been very exciting to see this project unfold. It's an area where there's a lot of violence against women because of resource extraction and colonization. There's a lot of violence against women due to wars that go on there because of who's going to control these resources. And it's really helped their empowerment, their leadership. So there's a cultural change happening as the women also rise to power through this leadership in this reforestation project. And so I just wanted to give sort of like a texture and tangible feel to, how do we actually take some of these ideas we've been talking about today and enact them into actually changing society, culture, relationship with the land, and creating a healthy relationship that's reciprocal and regenerative.
Beautiful. You know, if there's a kind of an open sore on planet Earth, it's Congo. That land has been so devastated for so long. It is just, whoa. I mean, Conrad called it the heart of darkness from his experience there in the Congo. Extraordinary book, by the way. So Osprey, I think that brings us to the beginning of our close. But one thing I'd love to have you share with our audience, which I personally found to be, I think, one of the most moving parts of your whole tale, is your own story of when you were 3 years old. You had an experience that I found completely arresting and inspiring, and I think it explains a lot for who you've become. So I would just love, in closing, for you just to tell that story.
Mm. Yeah, I wanted to share a personal experience of a worldview shift that I experienced in my youth, because I think all of us, actually, as I talk to people about that experience, have their moments too. And then how was that worldview accepted or not by the people around us also impacts what happens with that experience in our dominant culture. And so I was traveling across the country with my family. I had lived in Germany for 2 years as a toddler. My father was stationed in the army in Augsburg in Germany. And we landed on the East Coast and made our way to California, driving across the country, I believe, in a Volkswagen Bug. I somehow remember that part. I'd have to go back and check that. But anyway, we were driving across the country, and my parents were interested in other cultures. My mother was an artist, and we stopped in the Southwest somewhere, I don't know. And I asked my mother later, and she doesn't remember, exactly all the details. But of course, as a young person, it was, deep in my memory. She said we were in the Southwest, but she didn't remember exactly where. But we stopped. I believe it was a pueblo, and there were rain dances going on. It was a time of the year, and they have times where those dances are open to the public. A lot of them are private, and as they should be, and kept internal to the community. But this was a public dance where people could go. And there was a rain dance, and one of the dancers, who was in full regalia, bent down on a knee and shot an arrow into the sky to the thunderclouds as a way of bringing rain for the harvest. And I clearly saw that arrow went up into the sky, into the thunderclouds, and up into the stars. And the opening book is all about the stars. So that's how this story got woven into the first chapter. And the arrow came back and landed in my belly button, in my stomach. And I just thought at that age that it was part of the dance, didn't think anything unusual was happening. I just was excited and thrilled, and this is amazing. And, was on my merry way with this experience, and fascinated, and felt really changed. And it I was experiencing this dance, and all of a sudden my body was engaged in the dance through this experience of this arrow. And so, I shared that with my parents, and they immediately were like, that didn't happen. No, and explained to me, that it was an assimilation, pretending that the arrow went up, and that, as symbolic gesture, in simpler terms for a young person to understand. And it was very, distressing, like, no. And so, I sort of just got quiet, didn't know how to process all that was happening. And I have a photograph of being there with my sister and I. We're in these summer matching outfits, 2 kids, and my parents, and everyone is smiling, kind of like vacation photo. And I'm totally not smiling. I'm not unhappy. I'm not angry. I'm just, what?
Somewhere else.
Somewhere else. And then before we left, there's things that I don't remember. These are just, it's little. So there's just like little moments. I remember one of the indigenous men bending on a knee and looking at me, and I told him the story. And he smiled and said yes when I told him about the arrow. And it totally relaxed my body. And, I don't remember everything else that happened and we left or what have you. And then I never talked about it again, given the experience. And I don't think my parents were being unkind. They were trying to, they were in their worldview expressing what they thought was important for me to hear, and probably concerned or whatever, trying to be loving. And, but why I mention it is because I think we all do have these experiences, and they are very transformative. It's something that really shaped me and moved me and let me know that something beyond the world I had been experiencing, that was my reality, but there were other realities, that there were other ways of knowing, that there are other views. And it really blew open my world, even though I couldn't express it or talk about it. I didn't talk to my mother about it till many years later, because, it was sort of like, no. And then the last part I'll share, because it ties to the opening of the book, is that for me, in the opening of the book, I talk about it because it made me realize, not only that we have these experiences that can shift our worldview, but also it connected me to the stars in some way, which is why the opening of the book really is a reflection on fire and stars and all of these different elements. And I reflect upon how the North Star is sort of the umbilicus of the sky, and how we need to get reconnected with those ancestors and those ancestral stories that come from the stars, and how we are part and particle, our bodies are of the stars. So it's all a deep loop that brings us into that earth lineage again and our place in the greater universe.
Beautiful. Thank you. This is her book, everyone. Story is in Our Bones. Osprey Orielle Lake. Thank you so much, Osprey. This will bring us to a close on that extraordinary poetic note. Osprey can join the after chat for a little bit, everyone. You'll see the link to the after chat in the chat box. You received it in your Zoom reminders. And then on Monday, in our next Humanity Rising session, we're going to go to Australia to talk with another extraordinary woman named Mary Rodwell, who has made it her life's work to talk to people who've experienced the non-human intelligences, the ETs, most of whom are children. And I know after many of you listened to Marshall Summers the other day with his very pessimistic analysis of the alien agendas, you'll be really thrilled to hear from Mary Rodwell that upwards of 85% of all the people that report either abductions or direct experience with extraterrestrials engage in a transformational process that completely transforms their lives, and in many cases brings healing. So in Mary's point of view, the extraterrestrial experience is potentially a very important, positive, and healing, transformational opportunity for humanity. So we're going to bring her on just to contrast with what you heard from Marshall Summers. As I've said many times, we don't know what we don't know. And we're committed to bringing many points of view. But today we wanted to celebrate Osprey and her book, The Story is in Our Bones, and you can now join her for a little bit in the after chat. So thank you, Osprey. Thank you, everyone. Have a good weekend. See you on Monday.